Okay. I hope everything's okay here. I've been going between windows, so hopefully everything.
Introduce Tony. We can first thank our sponsors. This is the opening keynote for the Global Education Conference. Thanks so much to those who have supported the conference. This is in its third. And if you would like to, you can indicate where you're listening from. Tony would probably love that. Look for the star icon to the left of the map. It's the second icon down. You can click on it and click again on the map. Feel free to put a shout out in the chat as well. What a terrific group. So delighted to have everybody here. And Tony, I see your lips moving, but I think you have to hit that talk button for the audio to come through. Because we're not hearing.
Okay, you can hear me now, right?
We can hear you now.
You can hear me. Great.
Because you don't have slides, I'm going to find a good picture of you to put up on the screen. So we have
you can put up my website at TonyWagner.com.
Perfect. I will do that.
Great.
And Lucy, did you want to introduce Tony or let him just go?
I can go ahead and introduce Tony. That's fine. Thank you for being with us today, Tony. We're really excited to have you and thrilled to learn more about your follow-up to the Global Achievement Gap, which I think is an essential read for any school. And I heard you talk this summer at the Asia Society Conference and thought you would be a perfect fit for this. And we're thrilled to hear what you have to say, and I'm not going to belabor this any further. I want you to, people would rather hear you than me. So thanks for coming here. We're really appreciative of your time, and we can take some questions at the end if people have questions for Tony. So thanks, Tony.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucy. Great to hear your voice and to see you on screen. It's just a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk to so many committed educators from all over the world, and to have what I hope will be a real conversation. I'm going to try to limit my remarks to perhaps 30 minutes so that we can have some real questions and conversation, even if it's just virtual. So as some of you know, I really like to start with this quote from Einstein, that the formulation of the problem is often more essential than the solution. I think there are two fundamental challenges facing us in education in the 21st century that we must understand. The third challenge of access in emerging countries is one that I will not be addressing primarily now, but just so that you know, I'm very well aware that that is the third challenge. But in those countries that have access, that have some degree of broadband, I see two challenges. Number one, increasingly knowledge is becoming a commodity. It's free. It's like air. It's like water. No doubt some of you have been to the Khan Academy website, which has videos for students from K to 12 through secondary school on every conceivable academic subject. 6 million students a month going on to Khan Academy's website. Some of you probably also know about the trend recently of major universities, some of the most elite universities in America, have joined together in various consortia to offer a wide range of courses for free. Udacity, edX, Coursera, anybody in the world can take these courses. So quite simply, it used to be that you had to go to school to acquire knowledge. It was only the teachers who had what were at first the papyrus reeds or the clay tablets, and then later when Gutenberg came along, those very expensive things called books. So you had to go to the teacher, you had to go to school to acquire knowledge. That simply is no longer true for an increasing percentage of our population around the world. You get it on your cell phone. You can get it on your computer. You can go to the public library and access the world's knowledge from the computer in the library. So what that means is that the world simply no longer cares how much you know. What the world cares about is what you can do with what you know, which is a completely different education problem. Then it becomes a matter of developing students' skill and will, meaning motivation. Now, the second trend that we must understand is the changing nature of work. Increasingly in developed countries, and now beginning in developing countries, being able to merely work with strong hands is simply no longer enough. We have more and more machines taking over the work that used to be done by hand. So increasingly today, more work demands a smart head and not just smart hands, and also a smart head connected to smart hands. We call this the global knowledge economy, an economy where to really add value in the workplace, you have to have a different set of skills and not just be, have a lot of muscle. So I'm going to talk about the new skills for work in the 21st century, the new skills for citizenship and for learning, as well as this whole issue of will or motivation. Back in 2005, I read a book that changed forever my view of the world. It was called The World is Flat by Thomas Friedman. And if you've not read it, I really encourage you to do so, because he was the first one who introduced me to the rapidly changing nature of work from a connected world, where increasingly more and more work was being either offshored or automated, where anybody around the world could begin to think about developing new products or services and competing. And so I began to worry about what young people would need for skills to get and keep a decent job in this new global knowledge economy. So I did what was for me then a very different kind of research. This was then my fourth book. I started talking to a wide range of executives, literally from Apple to Unilever to the U.S. military. I talked to community leaders. I talked to college teachers. I talked to students who were recent graduates, asking everyone, what are the skills that matter most today? What are the gaps in the education that you see? And I came to understand that there's a set of core competencies every student must be well on the way to mastering before the completion of secondary school. Not just to have and keep a good job, but equally important for continuous learning and for active and informed citizenship in the 21st century. For the first time in human history, I think, the skills for citizenship in a democracy and the skills for work have converged. They are the same skills. They are knowledge skills. So, briefly, they are the 7 survival skills, as I call them. Number 1, critical thinking and problem solving. Over and over again, I talked to executives who said that the leaders in any sector, big business, small business, nonprofit, really expect all of their employees to think continuously about how to improve their product or their service. But when I asked these executives what they mean about critical thinking, it got interesting, because for too many of us in education, critical thinking is a buzzword. We haven't really been challenged to define it because it's not on the test. But out there in the real world, where the ability to think critically matters a great deal, over and over again, I heard the same definition of critical thinking. Critical thinking is the ability to ask the right questions, to ask really good questions, as opposed to having more and more of the right answers, which is what schooling is all about. And actually, even more important than problem solving out there in the world of work is what executives told me was the skill of problem identification. Going right back to the Einstein quote about the formulation of the problem. You start solving the wrong problem and you get nowhere. So that's the first skill. The second skill is collaboration across networks and leading by influence. More and more work is being done collaboratively, but it's also being done virtually, as we, in fact, are meeting today. Folks at IBM explained to me that when they have a customer need or a problem to be solved, they intentionally pull people from their different centers around the world to work on a virtual team. They do that because when they develop new solutions to problems, they have to be adaptable to different cultures and different countries' needs. So really deeply understanding differences, cultural, religious, and ethnic, is both a prerequisite for the effective virtual teamwork, but also a prerequisite for developing better products and services that can be used more widely around the world. Now, the way these teams are led is also very new and different. They're not led by supervisors with positional authority. They are led by peers through influence. The third survival skill is agility and adaptability. The complexity of problems, the pace of change, really favors those who are very agile and adaptable. You know, you contrast that with what I would call the regularities of school life, where today looks a lot like the same day last week, which looks a lot like the same day last year, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago. Very little happens in school that requires us to be agile and adaptable. The fourth survival skill is initiative and entrepreneurialism. It was Mark Chandler, who was then the vice president and general counsel at Cisco Systems, that large high-tech company, who talked about how executives worry about keeping that entrepreneurial spirit alive in the large companies that they run. He said, if I have an employee who sets and meets 5 goals, 100%, that's simply no longer good enough. He said, if on the other hand, I have an employee who sets 10 stretch goals, but perhaps only succeeds at 7 or 8, he or she is a hero. But what would that person be in our schools? That person would be a C or a B student, having missed 2 or 3 out of 10. I'm going to come back to that issue in a moment, the issue of failure and the difference between what makes you a hero in the workplace versus what gets you a grade of C or below in school. The fifth survival skill is effective oral and written communication, and it is the #1 complaint of both college teachers and employers. It was a senior executive at Dell who said to me, you know, the reason these kids can't write is because they don't know how to think. They don't know how to reason. And he said, that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem, he said, and I quote him, they do not know how to write with voice, meaning to put their own passion and perspective into their communications so as to be truly persuasive. You know, I was recently speaking to 500 of the most senior executives at a very large corporation in Australia. And as I was saying these things, the chairman of the board, the entire corporation, 250,000 employees, got up and said, you know, of all the things Tony Wagner has said, this idea of being able to speak with passion and to be persuasive is actually one of the most important leadership qualities in our business. You can crunch the numbers and come out one way or the other, but it is leaders who have passion and who can advocate that are often the ones who make the difference. The sixth survival skill is accessing and analyzing information. You know, information is changing constantly, growing exponentially. You know, Pluto was considered a planet for many years until recently. I mean, just as one example. Many of us had to memorize the periodic table when we were in high school, all of the different elements. Well, how many today could even name 10 or 15 of those 140-odd elements? And whatever number we think there are is actually wrong because 2 more were added last month. So the ability to access and, more importantly, to analyze information, to understand what is effective information, what are the different sources of information, is absolutely essential. Finally, curiosity and imagination. Now, back 4 years ago when I wrote The Global Achievement Gap, Dan Pink had come out with a book called A Whole New Mind, where he'd written about the importance of the so-called right brain skills, curiosity, imagination, empathy, creativity, as being increasingly important in sophisticated consumer economies, where consumers want more and better products and services that are more creative, more beautiful, more aesthetic, or more empathetic. But I've come to see these capabilities in a very new light in the context of my most recent research, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. So this book that I wrote 4 years ago, The Global Achievement Gap, came out, and 2 things happened shortly after it came out. Number one, I began getting requests from literally all over the world to come speak, from Taiwan to Singapore to Thailand to Bahrain, Spain, England, Finland, here in America, from Wall Street to West Point, and countless numbers of school districts and states and national education conferences. And everywhere I went, when I described these important survival skills, people nodded their heads. They said, yes, absolutely. But then, when I started talking about what I call the global achievement gap, and the global achievement gap is the gap between the new skills all students must be mastering versus what is taught and tested, even in our very best schools, people had a problem because they want accountability and they cannot imagine accountability without the standardized multiple choice tests that predominate, not just in America, but around the world. The sad thing is, students can become very good at these tests, but these test results tell us almost nothing about careers readiness, about the capacity to learn independently and continuously, and about citizenship readiness in the 21st century. These tests do not measure the skills that matter most that I've been describing. So that remains a continuing challenge, and I'm going to come back to this whole issue of creating new accountability systems in a few moments. But the other thing that happened shortly after my book came out is the global economic collapse from which we are still suffering. And for the first time in America, we saw students coming home with a college degree and unable to find a job. For generations, we've been telling our young people that the ticket to the middle class, the ticket to a good life, is to go to college. And sadly, what we find is that a BA degree is no longer a guarantee of a job. Now let's look at this a little more carefully, and we understand first and foremost that, we have naively thought that if a student went to college for 4 years, they would come out more skillful than when they started. But some recent research, notably the book called Academically Adrift, suggests that as many as a third of our college graduates are no more skillful in the competencies that matter most, critical thinking, communication, than when they started college. They're graduating with $25,000 of debt, no more skillful than when they started. And again, in the world today, it's not what you know that matters. It's what you can do with what you know. So those skills are even more important today than they were in the past. The other thing that we've come to understand is that just having skills is not going to be even good enough in the new global knowledge economy. That increasingly it's not just a knowledge economy, it is an innovation-driven economy. We're beginning to understand that our developed countries have become too reliant on consumer spending as the engine of growth. In America, it's over 70% of our GDP. Canada, it's 56%. I don't know what it is in some of the other countries where you are now. But we've come to understand, in a developing country context, we've come to see the importance of innovation in a completely different light, of coming up with dramatically better solutions to very basic problems, whether they are health or education or basic services. We need better and different approaches. So I've come to understand that it's not just these 7 survival skills that matter. It is also the ability to be an innovator. And let me define innovation for a moment. What I'm talking about here is not just science, technology, engineering, and math. I'm talking about the ability to be a creative problem solver and to bring a spark of imagination to whatever it is you're doing. I had a fascinating meeting this week at the Inter-American Bank with Mauricio Cabral and his colleagues, and they were talking about social innovation, social entrepreneurship, and creative capability as becoming an important engine of economic growth in Latin America. I think he said that in Mexico, the creative arts are 7% of their economy. And you go to even a city like New Orleans in our country, and you see how so many of the creative arts are absolutely essential for their economy. So it's the creative, it's the problem solver put together that makes the innovator. Now, you know, America's always been known as a highly innovative country. But is that because of or in spite of our education system? You know, we have availability of venture capital. We have strong laws for copyright protection and so on. We have, until recently, had a very liberal and welcoming immigration policy. But what about education? Well, I sometimes tell the joke in live audiences that may be a little harder in a webinar, but I ask, what do Bill Gates, who created Microsoft, Edwin Land, who invented the Polaroid instant camera, Bonnie Raitt, very innovative folk singer, and Martin Zuckerberg of Facebook fame, all four have in common? Well, a lot of people say they were college dropouts. I like to sort of remind people they're not just college dropouts, they're Harvard college dropouts. Steve Jobs, Michael Dell, they were just college dropouts. So I became very interested in the question for this new book of mine. What must we do differently as parents, as teachers, as mentors, and as employers to develop the capabilities of many, many more of our young people to be creative problem solvers? You know, we're all born curious, creative, imaginative. We're born with the capabilities that are essential for innovation. Until those qualities are either schooled out of us or, in some cases, parented out of us. So I interviewed a wide variety of young people in their 20s who were highly innovative, some in science, technology, and engineering, some who were social entrepreneurs and innovators, some very involved in the arts. Several of whom were either immigrants themselves to this country, one guy from Sierra Leone, or others whose families had immigrated to this country. So it's a very interesting cross-section. Some kids who've grown up with real privilege, others who've grown up in real poverty. Then I interviewed their parents, seeing if I could discern patterns of parenting. Then I asked each one of them, was there a teacher or a mentor who made a great difference in the lives of these young people? And I came to see something that really shocked me. In every case, the teachers who'd made the greatest difference in the lives of these young people were themselves outliers, who taught in ways that were very different than their peers in the school. And I'm talking from elementary school all the way to graduate school. There was, at the university level, they were outliers to such a degree that none of them had tenure, nor were they going to get tenure. Then I went to those few schools that have a powerful reputation for graduating students who are very innovative. I'm talking about High Tech High in San Diego, which I described in the Global Achievement Gap. The New Tech High Network, which I also mentioned in the Global Achievement Gap. But also some schools I had not visited in some time. There's a brand new college in Massachusetts called the Olin College of Engineering, O-L-I-N. There's the MIT Media Lab. And finally, I went to the D School, the Institute of Design at Stanford. And I came to see that in every case, the kind of teaching I saw in all of these schools, from high school to graduate school, was remarkably consistent. And it was the same kind of teaching that my outlier teachers whom I had interviewed were doing. So what I've come to understand, and what I write about in this new book called Creating Innovators, the Making of Young People Who Will Change the World, is that, in fact, there's a series of contradictions between the culture of schooling as it's widely practiced and disseminated around the world versus the culture of learning that develops the capability to be an innovator. There are 5 contradictions. Number 1, culture of schooling is all about celebrating individual achievement and kids triumphing over other kids. But it turns out innovation is a team sport. There is no innovation without collaboration because the problems are too complex. And so in every case, the teachers that I observed and interviewed built accountable teamwork into every single subject, or in many cases, individual assignments and projects. They valued teamwork as much as they valued individual achievement. Number 2, specialization and compartmentalization of knowledge. The higher up you go the education ladder, the more knowledge is compartmentalized. We have something called Carnegie units in the United States, where we divide and conquer the high school universe into separate subjects, a system that is widely imitated around the world. We also, as we go to college, we declare a major. We have to decide what it is we want to become experts at. What's the content knowledge we should have? And so what I've come to see is that whole idea of specialization is radically at odds with learning to be an innovator, where you study and understand problems from a multiple disciplinary perspective. It was Judy Gilbert who said to me, if there's one thing educators must realize, is that problems can neither be understood nor solved within the bright lines of academic disciplines. So she's director of talent at Google and is really working to develop these kind of cross-disciplinary teams and conversations. The third contradiction has to do with how we learn in school. The further up you go in the schooling ladder, the more time you kind of spend sitting passively. It's called what I call the sit and get approach to learning. Maybe that's in fact where we learn to become such good little consumers. It's how we learn in classrooms. But not so in the classrooms that teach innovators. Those classrooms are all about students creating, not consuming. Creating real products for real audiences. The last two contradictions, I think, in some ways represent one of the most greatest pair of challenges for us in education. You know, the world of schooling is a world where we penalize failure and we reward compliance, getting along, going along, for students as well as teachers. It creates a very risk-averse environment, which is completely the opposite of what it takes to innovate. The world of innovation is all about taking risks, making mistakes, and applying what you've learned to your next project, process, or service. I went to IDEO, one of the most innovative design companies in the world, and they told me their motto is fail early and fail often. Heck of a way to run a company. Then I went to the Institute of Design at Stanford University. We were talking to teachers there, and they kind of said, you know, we're thinking the grade of F is actually the new A, meaning kids who, quote, failed may actually have learned the most. Finally, I talked to a student at the Olin College of Engineering, and she said to me, you know, we don't even talk about failure here at Olin in our courses. We talk about iteration, my new favorite word, the idea of iterating from version 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0, reflecting on each project that you've done, what worked, what didn't work, and applying what you've learned to the next version or iteration. The last contradiction is in some ways the most fascinating. What I discovered among these young innovators, every single innovator, whether they were from privilege or poverty, is that they were far, far more intrinsically motivated. You know, we in education rely on extrinsic motivations, carrots and sticks, A's and F's, to incent learning. But these young innovators were not innovating to make money. They wanted to make a difference more than they wanted to make money. And then when I looked at what their parents and teachers had done to nurture and reinforce those intrinsic motivations, I found a pattern. Both parents and teachers had encouraged play, passion, and purpose, all three. Parents encouraged their younger children to engage in more discovery-based, exploratory play, play without specific objectives or structure. And teachers created assignments that had an element of playfulness, or what Ed Carrier, who teaches a sequence of courses called Smart Product Design at Stanford University for engineers, called an element of whimsy, something that he thinks is very important in every project or assignment he gives his students. These same parents encouraged young people in the process of play to find and pursue a real passion, to develop a deep interest in something. They valued this quality more than academic achievement for its own sake, because they realized that in the process of pursuing a passion, young people acquire the discipline, the perseverance, the tenacity that becomes so critical for any kind of adult success or achievement. Teachers, the same thing. They realize that one of the most powerful motivations for learning is the ability to frame your own question, design your own investigation, or just choose a topic that you simply want to learn more about. And so they built time into their classes for those kinds of investigations and projects. It was fascinating to discern that as these young people grew older and pursued their passions morphed, they changed, they evolved, until in every case they became a deeper sense of purpose. All of these young people, as I've said, wanted to in some way make a difference in the world. And that's because both their parents and their teachers had emphasized the importance of giving back, making a difference, even if it's in just very small ways. So let me take a couple of minutes to suggest what I see as some sort of implications for our work. And then I'm really anxious to see what kinds of questions you have. I mentioned earlier the importance of creating Accountability 2.0. The accountability systems we have in this country and in most every other country that I have visited are not aligned with the outcomes that matter most. They're not testing the skills that matter most. They're not assessing the habits of mind and the dispositions of the capacity to innovate. So I think the greatest challenge in our education systems is to create Accountability 2.0. And I think to do that, we're going to have to reach out and work with business and community leaders to create a consensus on the outcomes that matter most. What should a high school graduate know and be able to do in a world where you can look up facts on your phone or go down to the public library and log in and find out whatever it is you need, or even take entire courses? What is school for if it is no longer the place where you have to go to acquire knowledge? I think it becomes a very different conversation in our communities as we talk about what does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean to be a valued employee? What are the skills that matter most? And how do we create an accountability system aligned with those skills and competencies? In terms of what we can start with, I would say that every student should start kindergarten with a digital portfolio, where a student begins to collect evidence of the ability to think critically, communicate effectively, be an independent and creative learner, and work collaboratively. And that we should see student digital portfolios as evidence of mastery through a body of work developed over time. As a part of Accountability 2.0, I want to see students at the end of 12th grade, 8th grade, and 5th grade doing capstone projects, which are exhibitions and performances where they have to show mastery of real skills. That demands that we as teachers think very carefully about what skills are we teaching in a lesson or a unit of study. You know, of course content's important, but we need to use rich and challenging content to teach and assess real skills. So from my point of view, that's all a part of Accountability 2.0. We need to start using dramatically better assessments like the College and Work Readiness Assessment. You can go to the website www.cao.org to find out about the College and Work Readiness Assessment, as well as the Collegiate Learning Assessment. Both tests assess students' abilities to reason, to analyze, to think critically, and above all, to write effectively. So these tests are not as cheap as the computer-scored multiple-choice tests are, so we're going to have to use a sampling or an auditing strategy in our assessments, much like the PISA testing does. In fact, that's what Finland, a country noted for its education success, does. It's the only form of testing. They don't do any kind of assessments that are to do with accountability. So, two more quick points here. I've spoken about the skills. I've spoken about accountability 2.0. To the issue of will or motivation. You know, Google has a rule. When you go to Google, you have 20% of your time in the workplace to work on any project of your choice. And it's been the primary engine of innovation at Google, are people working on projects of their choice. 3M has a 15% rule, has long had that rule. I would like to see the Google rule in every classroom in the world. I want to see students having 20% of their time in school, whether it's 1 day a week or in a part of each unit of study, where they are asking their questions, where they are determining what it is they want to learn, know, understand, or get better at, where they are designing their own explorations. I think this is how we develop the capacity to be self-disciplined, the capacity to focus and concentrate, the capacity to make mistakes, reflect on them, and learn from them. Finally, you know, there are really 3 foundations for preparation for work and citizenship in the 21st century. 3 pillars, if you will, 3 legs of a stool. One is content knowledge. Of course, content knowledge matters. But as we've been saying, that is increasingly available in lots of places that don't require you to go to school to get it. But it matters. It's important. The second is skill. And whether it's my list of the 7 survival skills or other lists that your community comes up with, it's very important to think about teaching and assessing skills every single day. The third that I've been talking about, especially in terms of what creates an innovator, is motivation, being intrinsically motivated. And of the 3, motivation is the one that schools probably do the most damage to and is in fact most important. Because if you are intrinsically motivated, you will be a lifelong learner. You will acquire new skills and new content knowledge as you need it. And increasingly, we are all going to be needing to continuously acquire new skills and new knowledge. All right, so we have about 15 minutes left in this webinar, and I really would like to see your questions, your comments, your concerns. Lucy, I don't know how this works, but I'd love to see questions appear somewhere on my screen.
I don't know if this is causing feedback or not for me to talk at the same time, but I think one of the questions that we're seeing right now is how do we get larger bodies to agree to this kind of mindset, and how do we get parents on board and feeling comfortable that this is okay and the way of the future?
Well, I think those are enormous challenges, because parents want schools to look like the ones they went to, and teachers teach often in ways that they've been taught. And this is why I mentioned the importance of creating community dialogues about how the world has changed and what our young people need to know and be able to do in this changing world. I worked with a community in Virginia Beach, very diverse, very large school district that had such a dialogue. They organized a wide variety of opportunities for people to give input into what the priorities for the school district should be in light of a lot of research and data that they had done. They had interviewed employers about the skills that matter most and videotaped those interviews. They had interviewed graduates and asked them in what ways they've been most and least well prepared. And so they developed this long list of possible outcomes. And then they had people talk in tables. This was in a large civic auditorium about how the world has changed, about this new research and data, and then consequently, what's most important. And then they gave everybody clickers and a chance to vote. And it was a fascinating process to watch, because once people had really had a chance to work through these ideas, to work through the data and the research, and to think about a changing world, this is adult constructivist learning I'm describing. Once they had a chance to do that together and really construct an understanding of a changing world, they voted overwhelmingly that all students should be taught to think critically and to learn independently. And that then set a very different course and set of priorities for that school district, which is still carrying them forward in terms of the kinds of change that they're trying to accomplish. I wrote that up, by the way, as a case study, which is in the new last chapter for the paperback version of the Global Achievement Gap, if people want to learn more about that study. It was also published in the September issue of School Administrator, if folks are looking for another resource. Other questions?
Yeah, the next one that seems to be popping up too is colleges of education. My husband is sharpening his pencil in the background. Don't you love webinars? Anyway, colleges of education, what do we need to do to prepare future teachers so that we aren't dealing with a retroactive mindset? That's the next question.
Yeah. Well, I think this is absolutely critical. I'm so glad this question came up, because you look at the example of Finland. And Finland 35 years ago was a pretty poor agrarian economy and a very underperforming education system. And they had the kind of dialogues that I'm describing to you that we need to have in this country. And out of that came a real sense of urgency that they had to not merely incrementally improve their education system, but transform them. Excuse me. And to transform their education system to really prepare young people who were their really only natural resource to be active participants in a civic society and a knowledge economy. So the heart of their educational transforming was two things. Number one, ensuring that every student got exactly the same high-quality education, grades 1 through 9. And then beginning in grade 10, young people had a choice of an academic track or a career vocational track. And today, 45% of the kids choose a career vocational track. So on the one hand, it's the same high standards for every kid, but on the other hand, it's differentiation beginning in 10th grade, allowing kids to find different paths to what most interests them. But the other thing they did was a laser-like focus on dramatic improvement of the preparation of teachers. Beginning in the mid-'70s, every single teacher had to earn a real master's degree, not one that you kind of mail away for. And they had to do real research. And they also had to spend at least a year working in a kind of the equivalent of a medical residency, working in teams with master teachers, where they really developed a very sophisticated understanding of what is effective teaching and learning. So from my point of view, schools of education in this country are mostly broken. I've been involved with several of them, and I don't see the kind of preparation that is going to make enough of a difference. It's interesting, High Tech High, my favorite network of schools in this country, 4,000 kids, grades K-12 in San Diego, which I write about in the Global Achievement Gap, was so frustrated with the quality of teachers they were getting from these schools of education that they have started their own graduate school of education, which I describe and write about in my new book, Creating Innovators. And it's modeled much more after the Finnish model, where teachers are doing very, very high quality intellectual work, they're doing projects, and they're also involved in internships with master teachers. Time for a few more questions, I think.
Okay, we had another question too. Somebody asked, can you give me one specific way to get my teachers to release authority to students, to allow students to do what you are suggesting? So I think that's another tough one. And if I wish we were doing this more collectively than just in our classrooms. That's what comes to my mind. But anyway, any ideas for helping teachers to release authority to their students?
I think here's one. Yes. Here's what I would recommend, that we think about a portion of our professional development money in schools and districts as an R&D fund, a research and development fund. And if we put out a kind of a set of specifications, if you will, and we invite teams of teachers to apply for some R&D money to create an interdisciplinary course, to develop a project-based learning approach in their classrooms, to use digital portfolios. We have to incent our early adopters and our risk takers. We have to incent innovation in education. teachers are kind of notoriously risk-averse because that's how they're trained and that's how they're acculturated in schools. So if we want teachers to take risks and to relinquish authority, we're going to have to incent and encourage them to do that, and they can't do it alone. I find that risk, when it's spread out across a team, is far easier to take and to tolerate. That's why I would say it should be teams of teachers who apply for these kinds of R&D grants to develop new ideas and new practices.
Any specific ideas for creating cultures of innovation with higher education? I know we talked a little bit about the teacher preparation programs, but specifically in teachers who are already in service, what can the universities do along these lines of R&D? Any other ideas on that vein?
Yeah, it's really the same. I would apply exactly the same set of ideas I just described for schools and school districts to colleges. And in fact, Tulane University has done that, and I describe it as a case study in creating innovators. They've created an R&D fund. They've tried to incent and reward teachers for going out and creating partnerships in local communities and creating opportunities for students to learn skills of social entrepreneurship and innovation. So Tulane is a very interesting model, I think, to look at.
So what's your opinion of programs like Race to the Top and that sort of thing? Do you think that they actually, from a governmental perspective, what does the U.S. government need to do? I know this is not applicable to everybody in the room who's from another country, but I think it's interesting to watch. Do you think Race to the Top does this, and what can our government do better along the regards of increasing this kind of attitude?
Well, it's interesting. I had an opportunity just this past week. I was in Washington talking with officials at the Department of Education, and I'm very critical of Race to the Top because I think while the concept is okay, it created some incentives for the wrong kinds of behaviors. The good news about Race to the Top is it encouraged states to adopt what we call the core curriculum. Now, I think the core curriculum has some problems, but it's a step forward from the idea that Minnesota and Mississippi could have an entirely different set of standards for kids. So that's, I think, a real step forward. But I think the problem with Race to the Top was that it required states to evaluate teachers on what are called value-added metrics, meaning it requires states to evaluate teachers to some degree on whether or not those teachers have improved test scores. Now, if we have bad tests that are multiple choice factual recall tests that tell us nothing about career readiness, continuous learning capability, or citizenship in the 21st century, then the idea of measuring a teacher's effectiveness on the basis of a test score where students really don't care about that test, and the test doesn't really tell us any of the things we need to know, I think is a very serious step backwards. And 32 states have adopted this legislation. By contrast, I believe I can and I should be held accountable for improvements in my students' work from September until May. That's why I want to see a digital portfolio. That's why I would like to see teachers be assessed and peer-reviewed on the basis of teachers' digital portfolios. Similarly, Race to the Top incented the creation of charter schools. Now, I want to be clear, I helped start one of the first charter schools in Boston. I think there are some charter schools out there that are doing a remarkable job of creating radically new and better models of education for the 21st century, but that's not the majority of them. The majority of them are doing things that are no different, or in some cases, far worse than the public schools. So I think it was a serious mistake to require states to have more charter schools. They're divisive, and they're an unproven kind of innovation. What I would rather have seen is that the federal government encouraged the opening of lab schools, laboratory schools. I want to see district, state, and nonprofit-sponsored lab schools, not necessarily charters, but they're schools of choice where teachers and parents come together to intentionally develop the practices that are essential for 21st century teaching, learning, and assessment. Now, to the final question, what can governments do? It's all of these things. It's incent educational R&D. There is no innovation without R&D. There is no change without R&D. The idea that you can create change through compliance is an old bureaucratic notion that is obsolete and it never worked well to begin with. People don't do their best in a compliance-driven system. They do the minimum they have to comply, to get by. We have to incent and motivate and encourage radically better behaviors from students and teachers. And so the way I think we do that is to encourage them to experiment, to explore, to take risks, and to innovate.
I think that's the perfect ending, and I want to make sure that we end with enough time for people to get on to the next session. And I know people still have lots of questions for you. We'll start a discussion forum post in our website, and I'll send you the link, Tony, if you want to respond to any of the questions, because we've got 50,000 of them right now. And perhaps you'll want to respond. I also was thinking about, when you mentioned charter schools, I was talking to a friend recently who went to Sidwell Friends when apparently you were a teacher there. They did not have you as a teacher, but Sidwell and other schools like that are, I think there's something to be said about learning from independent schools because they have a culture to be innovative too. And I would personally love to see independent schools, partner with public schools to kind of, cross-pollinate that mindset as well too. So anyway, I want to thank you so much. Let me stop talking.
At Sidwell, I was just saying, it's interesting, at Sidwell I helped develop the first requirement for graduation of service learning or community service. So it's a perfect example of an independent school innovating, and innovating in ways that I think public schools can and should also attempt. But I just simply want to end by thanking folks for coming. These are, very, very challenging times for educators. I don't need to tell you that. You know that better than I. But the fact that you're taking your time today to engage in this conversation, and you're committed to trying new things and to learning new things, I think bodes incredibly well for the future of our profession. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate your listening.
Thank you, Tony, for sharing your time with us. We really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll follow up with some more questions in our discussion forum. This session will be recorded. I will send you the link, Tony, afterwards, and it will be accessible on our website for anybody who dropped in halfway through. I think it's an incredibly valuable conversation and sets the tone for the rest of our event here this week, because we're going to be talking about a lot of the things that you mentioned. There are a couple speakers that come to mind that really kind of touch on some of the things you've talked about, Tony, namely Dale Doherty of Maker Education from the Make magazine. I think he's totally right up your alley. So thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to stop recording in a moment so that you can get to the next keynote, which is Seymour Simon and Liz Nealon. And thanks for coming, and Tony, thanks again for your time. We really appreciate it. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Lucy, for organizing this. It's a great contribution. Thank you.